Hey YouTube, today we're going to talk about a subject that seems to be touchy with a lot of revolver people. And we're going to talk about the differences in a pre-lock Smith and Wesson revolver and a newer Smith and Wesson revolver. But before we get started, I'm going to let you know that none of these revolvers I have here in front of me are loaded, and if and when I pick any of them up, I will show you there's nothing in them. They've all been safety checked, folks. We're safe to make this video. So, subject for today is pre-lock Smith and Wesson revolvers and what they are. So, the pre-lock Smith and Wesson revolver is a terminology that's come up with the gun collector crew. And it's basically a revolver that was made before Smith & Wesson started putting an internal lock on them. So we're going to go through a little history about how this came about and why people really are drawn to these revolvers and what some of the differences is in them. So we'll start off with a little bit of history. In the 1970s, the Carter administration was in charge of the United States, and if you do any kind of research or anything, you'll know that the country was in some very hard economic times when Jimmy Carter was president. I mean, he was a nice man, but he really wasn't a good president when it comes to economics. And Smith & Wesson was pretty much at the top of their game. They made some of the best quality revolvers in the world at the time, and you just really couldn't beat them. You know, the quality you got, and they were somewhat affordable for what you were purchasing when you bought it. Well, with rising costs of materials and labor cost and the demand starting to go down a little bit, when at the end of the Carter administration, Smith & Wesson started really suffering economically. Smith & Wesson was bought from the Wesson family in 1965, and they did very well. You know, they started making basically other stuff like holsters, handcuffs, and other stuff, and it accounted for about 25% of their sales. 25% of their sales were not firearms, folks, and they did very well at it. They really built the company up and everything. But as demand started to go down because of economic stresses, you know, they had to start looking at other ways to keep the company afloat. So fast forward into the 1980s, you know, the quality really started going downhill. You know, you weren't getting your quality control. Things weren't made quite as well as they were, you know, back when Smith & Wesson was really at the top of their game and everything. And they started producing like subpar stuff. Well, they seemed to turn it around a little bit. But then came the semi-automatic craze. The 9mm craze came out. And a lot of police departments and stuff like that was really more reliant on semi-automatic 9mm, and it really put a dampener on Smith & Wesson. So Smith & Wesson started producing semi-automatic 9mm, and one of the most popular ones, I don't know all the model numbers, folks, but one of the most popular ones was like the 5906. It was a stainless steel semi-automatic handgun, and a lot of police departments used it. But they had a reputation of being spotty when it comes to reliability and stuff like that. And then when 1985 came along, the United States military decided to start using the Beretta 92 as their sidearm. Well, Smith & Wesson had a hard time competing in the world because everybody chose the Beretta over the Smith & Wesson due to the fact that the military used it. It had been through rigorous testing, and it was quite honestly more reliable than the Smith & Wesson like 5906 and stuff like that, the 6906s and all that. So then in comes the Glock pistol into the United States, and that was really the elephant in the room for Smith & Wesson. You know, none of these revolvers could compete with the Glock and the police departments and all that. So these things were really starting to, you know, fade away when it comes to police departments wanting to use them and stuff. Not a lot of people, they were trying to get away from the revolver because of the limited capacity and all that. So they started experiencing some hardships, and Smith & Wesson's changed hands many times over the years. They've had a lot of problems with the company and everything like that. Well, fast forward to the 2000s, President Bill Clinton was elected, and he was probably the most anti-gun president that's ever been elected into office, and he wanted to try and figure out how to ban firearms. He was not in favor of the Second Amendment. He did not think that American people should own firearms, and he was pretty anti-constitutional, to be honest with you. And in 1994, he signed the assault weapons ban, and he made it to where you couldn't have a magazine that was over 10 rounds, and amongst other things, he wanted to strong arm the firearm companies into signing agreements to come out with these new smart guns. So in 2000, I believe it was the HUD agreement that got signed, and Smith and Wesson, in their financial distress, signed an agreement saying they were going to create new technology and make new smart guns. And what they did is, I'll pick one of these up here. This is a Smith and Wesson 686 no dash. And what they did is they put an internal lock system in them. So where you have this magazine or this cylinder release right here, right above here, there would be a little hole with a keyhole in it, and you would turn the key and it would lock the hammer, and it would not operate at all when you had the lock on. And it was a safety feature, and basically Smith and Wesson sold out for money. Well, it was not received well amongst the gun community. They knew why it was there, and a lot of gun stores refused to carry Smith and Wesson firearms in their store because they were complying with these new government policies, and they voluntarily signed an agreement with the Clinton administration saying they would implement these new safety features. Now, is the safety feature really that bad, folks? It's not really. You can either choose to use it or not, but a lot of people look at these guns and they see that little hole right up here on the top of the cylinder release, and they just think it's hideous looking, and it really isn't that attractive looking. But is it really that bad, folks? I mean, there's a lot of other things on here you could look at that some people would like and some people wouldn't. Some people like bigger hammers on them, some people like smaller hammers, serrated triggers. So is a little hole with a key that goes into it really that big a deal? In the grand scheme of things, it really isn't, folks. And that's not why people are drawn away from him. What they're drawn away from is the politics involved in it. Smith & Wesson caved in, and they said they would not sell their firearms in any gun store that sold assault weapons. And, folks, that is not a thing to do when you're trying to appeal to this the 2A crowd. 2A crowd people are very proud of their Second Amendment, and they have a right to be proud of that, and it really hurt them very badly when it came to their firearm sales. Now, some of the other things about the Smith & Wesson Prelocks is when they started making these Prelock revolvers, they were very well made. You know, these were the original ones that were made, and all the parts on the inside of these things and on the inside of a Prelock revolver, they all have forged parts. The triggers, the hammers, and stuff like that were all forged frames, and they were very well fit together. And they came with very nice wooden walnut grips on them and stuff like that. Well, over the times when you get into financial distress and you start cheapening things up, you know, your quality really starts to go downhill. So around that time that they started adding the lock onto the frame of the revolvers is when they started cheapening stuff up. So you started noticing things like they had like sleeve barrels in it. You know, there were 2-piece barrels that were sleeved. The hammers and the triggers were all cast, just not as well made. And when you add the fact that it had a hole drilled in the side of it and you had a key that stuck in it, it was bad. Now, there are documented cases out there where that lock failed a couple times, and as a firearm owner and as a Second Amendment advocate, anything that was attributed to the failure of a Smith & Wesson revolver at the time was blamed on that lock. And that's not necessarily always true, folks. It could have been the cheapening of the manufacturing process. I'm sure that some of it was the actual lock, but everything, any problems that was brought upon these Smith and Wesson revolvers was blamed on that lock, and people just got a real bad taste in their mouths. Now, a couple other examples of firearm companies just made bad decisions is like Winchester, when they changed their manufacturing process in 1964. They made a little bit cheaper way to manufacture guns, and people, went off their rockers about that. Were they still good guns? Yeah, the quality wasn't quite there right after the 1964, but they improved it over time, and they were still pretty good guns. But when people go out to buy a Winchester rifle, they want a pre-1964 because that was the original way when all the quality was there and everything. Now, Colt in the 1911 world, they came out with the Series 80 gun where they put a firing pin block on the inside. That's very similar to what Smith and Wesson did right here, only they didn't sign an agreement with the Clinton administration. And that really got people upset too, because it affected the trigger, and the trigger is the most important part to a 1911. A 1911 trigger is going to be your best pistol trigger you're ever going to feel. And if you make that a little bit cheaper and a little bit harder feeling, then it really draws away from the reason why people like 1911s. With the Smith & Wessons, it was all politics when they started putting those locks on them, and any problems that you had with a Smith & Wesson revolver usually were attributed to the lock, whether it was actually the lock or not. But when you start looking at the quality of them, the older revolvers were just made better, folks. Just the attention to detail. If you look at any of these revolvers, let's pick up another random one here. This is a 586 357 Magnum blued. The bluing on it's absolutely gorgeous. All the lines just look really well. It's very well made. It has color case hardened hammer on it and trigger. It's just a really well made firearm. The lock has nothing to do with it. It was the manufacturing process where they started cheapening things up, and they changed a couple of the designs. Like, one of the things they changed is they took this firing pin off of the hammer. That really makes no difference, folks, at all. But what people see is if it doesn't have the firing pin on the hammer, it's probably a lock gun, and they automatically don't want it. Now, in today's times, the way they manufacture stuff today with CNC machines and everything like that, is the quality there. It's probably not as built as quality as these guns right here, but they're every bit as reliable, folks. They're every bit as reliable. And Smith & Wesson got acquired shortly thereafter. They started putting those locks on those guns by another company that was not British. It was a British-owned company when they started putting the locks on. That's who signed the agreement. That's who made the deal with the Clinton administration, and that's what caused all the chaos in the Smith & Wesson community. But the new American-made company, and I can't remember what they were, they continued on with putting the locks on, and they're put on until this day. Now, if you fast forward into the present time, within the past couple months, Smith & Wesson is trying to compete with Colt, and Colt has re-released their revolvers. They have their own problems too, and they're a real big hit, because they're very well made. They have some of these classic revolvers that they came back out with. Well, Smith & Wesson has come out with the classic line over the years, and they have guns that look just like these, like this 586 that they stopped making years ago. They came out with guns like these, but they still had that lock on them. But it gave it that classic look. It didn't have the firing pin on the hammer, and it had a sleeve barrel and stuff like that. But if you look at it at first glance, it's a really good looking gun, and but people still really were not too interested in them because they had the all ugly lock on them. Well, here recently they announced that they've started making no lock frames again, and I think it's going to be a pretty big hit with the gun crowd. Smith & Wesson's had a couple decades to shake off their mistake that they made by signing an agreement with the Clinton administration and adding that lock on. And the first thing people ask when they go to buy a used Smith & Wesson gun at a gun show or online or something, is it a pre-lock? And what a pre-lock is, as I've showed, a pre-lock gun will not have this little lock right here. It'll look just like this. Instead of having a little hole in it, and this little cylinder release will look a little bit different shape. But the main reason they want it is they know that it's a better made gun. It's all forged, all the internal parts are forged and everything. And that's what they're really looking for. The word pre-lock is just something that's came up with the collector community. Now, these things demand a little bit more money than a brand new Smith and Wesson because people know that the quality went into them. They don't have the lock on them, and they were just basically a little bit better looking firearms. Now, are they really that better of a firearm? I would say probably not. You could take a brand new Smith & Wesson like 686 and shoot it next to this. You aren't going to see a lot of difference in accuracy or functionality or anything like that. But what makes these cool is like these combat grips on this one, the way they're made. You don't have the lock on them or anything like that. And it's just kind of a piece of history. And, you know, firearm collectors, they're a little bit of wingnuts sometimes, and they get a little bit drawn up into stuff. Now, I do agree with, you know, sort of boycotting Smith & Wesson at the time because I don't believe that any firearm company should sign any kind of agreement with any president or any administration that are anti-gun. And the Clinton administration was the most anti-gun administration probably that's ever been in office in my lifetime. They got a lot of stuff accomplished to attack the Second Amendment, and, you know, luckily for us, some of that stuff had a sunset on it, and a lot of it went away, and we're a little bit better times right now. But mainly the word pre-lock has been invented by the gun collector community, and they use it a lot of times to see if they can put a premium on their guns. When they get to sell them in a gun shop or a gun show or something like that, you'll go up and look at one of these guns here, and they're like, well, that's a pre-lock, so that's going to be X amount of dollars, or you could buy a new one for a little bit cheaper. But this is a way better gun. It is a little bit better made, folks, but is it really a better gun? I would say not. It's just these are more classic looking. These are when Smith & Wesson paid a lot more attention to detail. The parts were a little bit better on the inside of them, but the new ones are probably right along the lines of being a very good gun. It's just I prefer the older ones also because I actually know what went in the history and what went into putting those locks on. So I usually try and stay away from the locked revolvers. But anyway, I just wanted to give you a little look at the a couple of pre-lock revolvers here. I'll run down real quick and tell you what they are here. This is a Smith & Wesson 629-3. This is called the Classic Hunter. This is a Smith & Wesson 686 no-dash 6-inch 357 Magnum. This is a Smith & Wesson 66-2 357 Magnum. This is a Smith & Wesson Model 60 no-dash 38 Special. This is a Smith & Wesson 586-4 357 Magnum. This is a Smith & Wesson 686 no-dash 4-inch 357 Magnum. And this is a Smith & Wesson 586 no-dash 6-inch 357 Magnum. I figured I'd give you a quick run through of what I've used as examples. These are some of the pre-lock Smith & Wesson revolvers that I have. I'm very proud of the Smith & Wesson pre-lock revolvers I have. I like them a lot. I'd like to have a couple more that I'm missing that I'd really like to have in my gun collection, but you know, I can't have them all at one time. We'll figure it out one by one. But anyway, folks, let me know what you think about Smith & Wesson pre-lock revolvers. Do you understand why they're called pre-lock revolvers, and which one do you prefer? Thank you very much for watching my video today, and you folks have a great day.